In addition to that authenticity and being more real, there was also quite a bit of vulnerability, which we know from Brene Brown's work that vulnerability is what leads to connection. And so people opening up, sharing their hearts, sharing their tenderness, sharing their fears, and even their pain can go a long way in enhancing connection with other people. So I'm not saying go out and be vulnerable with everybody. There are lots of strategies with this, but it does help if you can allow yourself to be vulnerable and real and to be more human. That does allow us to feel more connected. Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Today, we're going to talk about how connection showed up in new and powerful ways at the Democratic National Convention and how that is reflective of some of what is playing out in the Democratic Party and campaigns in general. So I watched and listened to the DNC the week that my podcast launched, that this podcast became real in the world. And then I watched some of it again and have been reflecting on it because I kept noticing these themes. So these are the 3 specific threads or themes of connection that I'm going to specifically speak to today. So first, I noticed that there was more connection happening between people and speakers because it felt like there was more authenticity and vulnerability coming out from speakers, both which led to relatability so that people could actually relate more to people that were speaking, but also then connection, because when you can relate to someone, you can connect with them better. Second, I noticed spiritual connection in a new way with the spiritual language and beliefs that were being discussed in a way that I don't think I've heard before, although it's possible it's been happening, but it felt different. It felt more interfaith and less monotheistic, less Christian, and more interfaith and accepting of multiple religions and experiences and spirituality. So we're going to talk about that. And then third, there was a consistent theme throughout the convention, which was about us all being connected, about our interconnectedness, that we are all related, and in people being seen and understood and represented. It sort of felt like the DNC was like a celebration and a representation of different backgrounds and cultures and socioeconomic experiences, spiritual backgrounds, gender identities, sexual identities, expressions, all the things. It was like a multi-racial, multi-faith, interfaith, blended family where everyone is welcome and represented. And that said, before we get into those themes of connection and the way that people feel represented and seen by what has happened at the convention, I want to address one major theme of disconnection that I would be remiss in not addressing. So I am, of course, talking about the fact that not only was a Palestinian American not included in the planned program leading up to the event, the fact that the Democratic Party did not allow Representative Ruah Roman to speak as a representative of Palestinian American Democrats is mind-boggling to me. I have very strong opinions about the conflict in Gaza. I believe that we need a ceasefire immediately and recovery of all hostages. I believe that the U.S. should not be supporting or funding the extremist government of Israel in the horrific genocide that the government is committing. And I know that many people feel this way. I know that Jews, Gentiles, Muslims, Christians, any faith, no faith, a lot of people believe that this conflict needs to come to an end. It needed to come to an end a very long time ago. It should not have transpired the way that it had. There are so many different sides to this, and I know that I am not alone. I want to personally understand better what is going on with this conflict because I know that it is complex, and I want to understand why a stronger stance has not been taken by Democrats, by the Biden-Harris administration, and by Harris in her campaign. I want to understand if there's funding. I just want to understand more about what's going on so that I can also share that with all of you in hopes that we can understand it and understand what the path forward is. And I also want to specifically say that although I feel this strongly about Gaza, and I wish that Kamala had had a stronger stance on this at the DNC and that Ruah Roman was allowed to speak, I will still be voting for Kamala Harris because it feels like she is the one who can help us make change and affect change. And she feels like the right path forward for our country right now. There is no perfect path, and this feels like the right path. And I want to understand the situation better. So I will be working on that and bringing you along for the ride. In the meantime, because this episode is about connection at the DNC, I want to express that I know with certainty that the threads of connection that I am sharing here today with you were not felt by everyone and may not resonate with everybody. And I do not in any way expect that they make up for the experience of disconnection that many feel and have felt as a result of their experiences, beliefs, values, and issues of serious concern not being represented at the Democratic National Convention. And so I just want to speak to that before I get into how connection did show up, because I think it is important for us to talk about the paradoxes, the yes and, that there is connection in this experience. There is an immense amount more connection that I witnessed at the DNC than I have with political parties before, but there is also this sense of disconnection, which is complex. So it's both and. Okay. So let's get into how connection showed up differently and uniquely in the speeches and experiences of the Democratic National Convention, the DNC. I want to specifically mention that I am going to be quoting speeches and sharing snippets from speeches. The links to all of those full speeches are in the show notes. They are all linked in there. Okay, let's start with the first thread of connection, which showed up in speakers, leaders, and candidates being much more relatable, real, and vulnerable. So for me, it has felt for a long time that politicians are kind of separate from the people, that they are sort of at arm's length. They're politicking and saying the things that people want and need to hear. It often has felt like we're being sort of talked at, and there's like the rallying, but there's not like conversations with people. There's this whole sense in general of power structures of like power over people or power with people. So what I really appreciate is that there seems to be this shift happening. I think it's possible it started with the Obamas, but I don't really know. Somebody else would speak better to this than I can. But I think people over time have been starting to show up more authentically. It definitely happened with Michelle Obama, for sure, Barack Obama. And it's people choosing to be real and showing more of themselves. And that trend seems to sort of be continuing and gathering momentum. So candidates and people are showing up more in their humanity. And that then makes them more relatable and makes us feel closer to them, which is great. I hope it's not just a tactic. It is a useful tactic, but I also think that it's better for them as well. It felt like this sort of barrier or glassy shine of politicians was beginning to be like buffed out and removed more than normal with some of the speeches in the convention. So in addition to that authenticity and being more real, there was also quite a bit of vulnerability, which we know from Brene Brown's work that vulnerability is what leads to connection. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Brene Brown has an excellent TED Talk where she explains her research on understanding human connection and that vulnerability is the number one channel to that. I will link that also in the show notes. And it boils down to the fact that the number one factor in connection is vulnerability. And so people opening up, sharing their hearts, sharing their tenderness, sharing their fears, and even their pain can go a long way in enhancing connection with other people. So I'm not saying go out and be vulnerable with everybody. There are lots of strategies with this, but it does help if you can allow yourself to be vulnerable and real and to be more human. That does allow us to feel more connected. So I actually noticed this with Hillary Clinton, which was surprising. Her speech felt different than past speeches. And then her campaign in 2016, it just felt like she was more real, more raw, more like she was one of us, connecting with us rather than speaking at us. And perhaps that was because she is one of us. She's not the leader. She's not the candidate, but it felt really good to feel more connected to her as a person. And then there was Joe Biden. So Joe Biden, if you didn't see it, his daughter introduced him and he was in tears when he came onto the stage. And there was a very sweet moment between them. And he began his speech talking about family. And that's not abnormal by any means, but he spoke about Jill Biden, his wife. And he has for years spoken about her with such high regard, but I loved that he spoke about how he loves her more than she loves him. And that his heart beats so fast still when he sees her walking down the stairs. It felt so real. And maybe it's just the romantic in me, but I absolutely loved that. And then he specifically shared something that I really appreciated. And we've known this, but I appreciated that he shared it in this speech, which is that he chose to run, even though he had no intention of running. And he ran anyways. And this was in 2020, of course, but he ran because he knew that he needed to. And despite feeling like he had just lost part of his soul, he ran anyways because it was what he needed to do to be of service to the country, which is so powerful. And probably the most well-known speech from the DNC was Michelle Obama's, which is no surprise because she's an incredible speaker and she's very real. She's very authentic. She made an amazing comment about how someone might want to clue Donald Trump into the fact that the job that he's seeking may just turn out to be one of those Black jobs, which was incredible. But in terms of relatability and vulnerability, she shared that she was mourning the dimming of hope within her and that there had been a palpable sense of dread for our future. And my guess is that most people listening to that speech could relate. I definitely could. And there is obviously this momentum of hope, which I hope that we can continue. But her sharing that was so powerful in helping us to all feel connected to her. She also shared about the grief of losing her mother and saying specifically, she said, quote, "I wasn't even sure if I'd be steady enough to stand here before you," which evokes this incredible sense of empathy and in a really good way in connecting with her and being like, oh, this tenderness that you're holding, this grief that you're holding, you're showing us the fullness of what you're experiencing and allowing us to be a part of it, but also know that you're here with us. And so we feel a part of it, which is so powerful. Her husband, Barack Obama, followed up. And this was my favorite part of his speech. I love the politics part of it, but he said, "I am the only person stupid enough to speak after Michelle Obama," which I thought was just so great and really speaks to the relationship. And again, their relationship is something that they speak about enough that you understand that their dynamic is this way. And I love that about their dynamic. For me, potentially the most powerful and relatable speech was Pete Buttigieg, who I love. And he shared his powerful and also relatable life and story, painting a picture of the air fryer beeping and his 3-year-olds not wanting to wash their hands, and this picture that you can understand. And then specifically how amazing it is that his family even exists. Something he never could have imagined as a young, anxious, gay kid, unsure if he would ever find belonging in this world. And what an incredible testament he is. I'm going to also speak to some of the spiritual language that he uses in his speech, but I absolutely love him. And I think that he is a testament and a advocate for everything that we care about. He is a veteran. He is gay. He used IVF to have his children. Like there are so many issues wrapped up in this one person who is also full of grace, relatability, vulnerability, compassion, empathy. He's just a good guy. And I love him. I'm speaking of good guys that I love. I love Tim Walz. He is portrayed throughout the convention and has been throughout the campaign thus far as very human and very relatable because he is represented as a football coach, a teacher, a mentor, a gay rights activist, a good neighbor, a loving parent, and a guy who wears flannels. I love that Obama actually joked about him that his flannels were clearly not from a political consultant. He said, I think, quote unquote, they've clearly been through some stuff, which I love. And I love his flannels. So Tim Walz in his speech spoke about the struggles he and his wife, Gwen, had getting pregnant and how much he loved his kids. Obviously, clearly relatable and a really important issue right now with healthcare. And now his son, Gus, and the whole family are dealing with a despicable hate being blasted about Gus's learning disability and his appearance and expression at the convention. And I will tell you that I felt more connected to Gus Walz than any speaker or person at that convention. Watching him react to his father. And by the way, this was the day that I launched the podcast. It was my birthday. I was sitting on my couch watching Tim Walz's speech that night and just felt this incredible outpouring of emotional connection and support and really awe at Gus Walz's expression of his love for his dad and how proud he was and how overcome he was. I felt his emotions. I loved that they were flowing. He was vulnerable and real, and that's where connection comes from. And I am so glad that he was there. I hope beyond hope that he is feeling stronger and even more powerful for what he has endured and the way that he expressed himself, because it is truly an act of advocacy for people who need to feel seen and heard. Speaking of kids, I loved Kamala's stepdaughter, Ella, with her amazing outfits and authentic expression. She had all these different outfits and ways that she was showing up and the way that she spoke, which actually was showing up in this convention as well as sort of an authentic way for us to relate to people, was that it felt like people were not dressing so quote unquote corporate or political. There wasn't such a vibe of like, I need to look exactly the same way that people have historically. It was like, I want to see what people actually wear. Like, I want Tim Walz to wear a flannel on stage. I want people to dress in what they specifically express as. And that's actually something that would be really cool to talk to Natalie Tinger about, because she does a podcast called BU Style that I was on in December that's about your authentic expression in fashion. And it would be cool to talk to her about that. I will see if I can get her on the podcast. Okay. So, and then Ella's dad, Doug Emhoff, Kamala's husband. I loved his speech. I loved his speech because he was so relatable. He was like this guy that I could totally get to know. And like, he just felt like a real guy. He was sharing things about his family, his big blended family, and his mom and his dad, and how he worked at McDonald's to save money for school, how his group chat with his friends from growing up was blowing up, about how his fantasy team is called Nirvana, based on the band, which we love. He acknowledged his divorce with grace, which I really appreciated, and specifically thanked his ex-wife, Kirsten, and Kamala for being a parenting trio with him, which was so powerful to see that type of co-parenting and relationship that is such a testament to the type of person that he is and the type of person that Kamala is. He also shared how he fumbled his way through his first call to Kamala at 8:30 in the morning after being given her number for a blind date. And it was just an amazing story. And it's so relatable. How awkward can you be when you're calling someone and deciding to call at 8:30 in the morning is quite aggressive. But I loved that about him. It was so relatable. And so he talked about Mamala. So let's talk about Kamala. Kamala. Throughout the convention, people spoke about her, from her great nieces teaching everybody how to pronounce her name correctly, to her sister's speech, other family, friends, and colleagues. They all told the story of who she was as a politician and an attorney and as a spokesperson and an advocate, but they also told the story of who she really is as a person, which helps us to relate to her more. There are so many stories about how she shows up for people, for Ella and for Bo, for all the kids in her life, for her family and friends, for colleagues and members of Congress. There was a speech that was really amazing from a representative who shared that she broke down in tears the first time she met the vice president, and the vice president was incredibly supportive. And it also speaks to how supportive she is of people that she's never met and how she shows up for people that she doesn't know and stands up to bullies in the playground. And she's an advocate and she really believes in taking care of other people. So we heard about how Kamala's mother, Shamala, or Mommy, as Maya Harris explained, was tough. She was very demanding, and they were raised to believe that they could be and could do anything. She was apparently known to specifically say, don't sit around and complain about things, do something, which is such a cool message, but also it helps us understand where Kamala came from in a way that's more relatable. And I have to specifically mention that Maya Harris shared that where others feel detachment, Kamala fosters connection. That is a direct quote from her speech, which I loved, also linked in the show notes. The other thing that I noticed is that there were photos of Kamala and others throughout the Democratic National Convention and the videos that they created that were much more authentic than I've ever seen. Yes, you see the campaign videos, but there were photos of her as a teenager. There were photos of her as a kid, awkward teenage photos, candids and not so poised and put together, and these great photos of the family. And it feels much more representative of the people than, a put together politician often looks in professional photographs. So I don't know if it's the speechwriters cluing into what's helping people feel more connected, the fact that people are more comfortable being real now, or that there's actually a huge transition happening, a transformation. I hope that we are moving towards being more connected and more real as people. And that is something that I very much hope for. Okay, let's move on to the second thread of connection that I was noticing, and that is the thread of beautiful and sometimes new spiritual language that was showing up. So let's start by addressing the fact that Kamala Harris is a Baptist with a Hindu mother, a Jamaican Anglican father, and a Jewish husband. So perhaps that is contributing to the interfaith shift in the convention, but I also believe it is representative of the shift in our country. For years in political campaigns with politicians, there has always been God bless America. But in this convention, there was spiritual representation of Native American Indians, Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, indigenous traditions of all kinds, spiritual and atheist. It was truly an interfaith gathering, which was an absolute dream for me. And I would have loved even more of it personally, but I loved all that was there. So I want to share a specific few pieces that I really loved. First was the actual invocation at the beginning of the convention. It was two spiritual leaders. There was a Hindu leader, Sri Rakesh Bhatt, who shared chants and words of prayer, including the Asatoma Satgamaya, which part of it translates to lead me from the untruth to the truth, lead me from darkness to light. And he shared at the end of his prayer, we are one universal family. So good. And then Christian Bishop Leah Daughtry shared some scripture and a prayer, part of which really hit home for me. She said, quote, "We gather at a critical time in our nation when we are at the crossroads of hopelessness and hopefulness, when the forces of good and evil so plainly battle for the hearts and minds of our people, when right is called wrong and wrong is called right, when up is called down and down is called up, when fake is called fact and fact is called fake, when it seems truth forever on the scaffold and wrong forever on the throne. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos and confusion, we see now a light on the horizon." Gives me the chills. There were other examples of beautiful and resonant spiritual language that were used throughout the convention that I just want to call attention to because it's not something I've heard before. There was a discussion by Joe Biden that we're in a battle for the very soul of America, which I love. Raphael Warnock is an incredible speaker, to be expected as he is also a preacher, and he has always been an amazing speaker. He had so many quote-worthy moments, including one that has been published and made into memes and all different kinds of things. And I want to mention that here. He said, quote, "A vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children. And our prayers are stronger when we pray together." Which in essence, what he's saying is if we vote together, we are stronger together. I love that. A vote is a kind of prayer. I love that. And now I want to play you an actual clip from his speech because it is really powerful to me. And it is representative of the Christian values that I believe true Christianity teaches, that Jesus taught, not what Christian nationalism is trying to teach and extreme fundamentalist Christianity is teaching. So we're going to get to that on the podcast as the season progresses. We're definitely going to be addressing the Christianity issues right now at play, but I want to address that this specific piece of Warnock's speech felt really good to me. I am not Christian. And it felt really good to me to hear this addressed from a place of spiritual integrity. So let's listen to that.
America, make no mistake, Donald Trump is a plague on the American conscience. He is a clear and present threat to the precious covenant we share with one another. And yes, I saw him holding the Bible and endorsing a Bible as if it needed his endorsement. He should try reading it. It says, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. He should try reading it. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. It says, inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of these, you have done it also unto me. I choose the American covenant.
Pretty powerful, right? And then again, there was Pete Buttigieg. His speech, although short, was quite possibly the most impactful to me and speaks to both sides of connection because he was sharing vulnerably and relatably with his story, but then also because of what he says here.
Darkness is what they are selling. The thing is, I just don't believe that America today is in the market for darkness. I believe America is ready for a better kind of politics. Yes, politics at its worst can be ugly, crushing, demeaning, but it doesn't have to be. At its best, politics can be empowering, uplifting. It can even be a kind of soul craft. My faith teaches me that the world isn't made up of good people and bad people, but rather that each of us is capable of good and bad things. And I believe leaders matter because of what they bring out in each of us, the good or the bad. Right now, the other side is appealing to what is smallest within you. They're telling you that greatness comes from going back to the past. They're telling you that anyone different from you is a threat. They're telling you that your neighbor or nephew or daughter who disagrees with you politically isn't just wrong, but is now the enemy. I believe in a better politics, one that finds us at our most decent and open and brave. The kind of politics that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are offering. And as you have felt these many days, that kind of politics also just feels better to be part of. There is joy in it, as well as power.
He brings up faith, spirituality, and even uses the term soulcraft. He speaks to how the other side is appealing to what is smallest within you. This specifically, I believe, is speaking to the disconnected ego self that is driven by fear and othering, and how it feels better to be a part of the connected mentality that comes from your connected soul self that knows that we are all connected and we are all here for each other. So beautiful. Love me some Pete Buttigieg. All right, let's get on to the final thread of connection that I saw running throughout the convention. And this also runs through most Democratic campaigns right now. And I believe that is the foundation that we are all united, that we are all one people, and that we are here to take care of one another. I will not go through all of the speeches and incidences of this because there is so much of it, but I do want to share a few that really spoke to me. Hillary Clinton shared that Shirley Chisholm set the precedent of running on a campaign to care for, quote, the last, the least, and the lost. I love that. That was the first time I'd heard that. Maybe I should have heard it before, but it's really good. She also said, quote, it takes a village to raise a family, heal a country, and win a campaign, end quote. So true. And then again, Warnock shared an insightful piece about COVID-19 that really struck me. It's such a good example. He said, quote, we can heal. In a strange way, the pandemic taught us how. A contagious airborne disease means that I have a personal stake in the health of my neighbor. If she gets sick, I get sick. Her health care is good for my health. We are as close in our humanity as a cough. I need my neighbor's children to be okay, so my children will be okay. He then lists people and children from all over the world in different experiences, from inner city to Appalachia, from Ukraine, from Palestine, and from Israel, that everyone is part of the whole. Really, really powerful. And then Barack Obama reminded the convention that a lot of Americans are currently thinking, who will fight for me? And the idea is the Democrats are here to fight for everybody. I hope that is true. And I believe it is the closest to the truth. All right. And then finally, Kamala, of course, in her speech, as well as in many of the speeches that spoke about her, addressed the fact that she has only ever had one client, the people. And that is who she is here to serve, which is so powerful. I want to end by sharing some of the elements of Oprah Winfrey's speech, because they all speak to this connection and they all speak to the political elements at play right now. She shared this quote from the late Senator John Lewis, quote, no matter what ship our ancestors arrived on, we're all in the same boat now, end quote. She eventually speaks about how we are all connected. Our backgrounds don't actually matter. In the end, we are all here to take care of one another. Take a listen.
More often than not, what I've witnessed and experienced are human beings, both conservative and liberal, who may not agree with each other, but who'd still help you in a heartbeat if you were in trouble. These are the people who make me proud to say that I am.
In addition to that authenticity and being more real, there was also quite a bit of vulnerability, which we know from Brene Brown's work that vulnerability is what leads to connection. And so people opening up, sharing their hearts, sharing their tenderness, sharing their fears, and even their pain can go a long way in enhancing connection with other people. So I'm not saying go out and be vulnerable with everybody. There are lots of strategies with this, but it does help if you can allow yourself to be vulnerable and real and to be more human. That does allow us to feel more connected. Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Today, we're going to talk about how connection showed up in new and powerful ways at the Democratic National Convention and how that is reflective of some of what is playing out in the Democratic Party and campaigns in general. So I watched and listened to the DNC the week that my podcast launched, that this podcast became real in the world. And then I watched some of it again and have been reflecting on it because I kept noticing these themes. So these are the 3 specific threads or themes of connection that I'm going to specifically speak to today. So first, I noticed that there was more connection happening between people and speakers because it felt like there was more authenticity and vulnerability coming out from speakers, both which led to relatability so that people could actually relate more to people that were speaking, but also then connection, because when you can relate to someone, you can connect with them better. Second, I noticed spiritual connection in a new way with the spiritual language and beliefs that were being discussed in a way that I don't think I've heard before, although it's possible it's been happening, but it felt different. It felt more interfaith and less monotheistic, less Christian, and more interfaith and accepting of multiple religions and experiences and spirituality. So we're going to talk about that. And then third, there was a consistent theme throughout the convention, which was about us all being connected, about our interconnectedness, that we are all related, and in people being seen and understood and represented. It sort of felt like the DNC was like a celebration and a representation of different backgrounds and cultures and socioeconomic experiences, spiritual backgrounds, gender identities, sexual identities, expressions, all the things. It was like a multiracial, multi-faith, interfaith, blended family where everyone is welcome and represented. And that said, before we get into those themes of connection and the way that people feel represented and seen by what has happened at the convention, I want to address one major theme of disconnection that I would be remiss in not addressing. So I am, of course, talking